Hello, I'm Ernie Humphrey, the CEO and COO of Treasury Careers. I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time to join us for our webinar today, T&E Expenses Matter, Establishing the Visibility and Control Your Company Deserves. Second only to payroll, T&E spending comprises the largest business expense for companies. T&E is also the second most difficult operating expense to control. Today, you will discover how companies of all sizes are leveraging technology to establish visibility, benchmark costs and expenses, and establish controls, which lower expense report processing costs, fuel more effective T&E spend, and improve productivity across the enterprise. I would like to thank our webinar partner, Certify, whose strong commitment to thought leadership helps us make this webinar possible today. Few quick words about Treasury Careers. Treasury Careers offers content and resources that empower Treasury professionals to own their career success. We have a plethora of Treasury job opportunities posted. We have quite a few Treasury certification resources. We offer complimentary webinars like this one we're on today, and we have several resources in the area of Treasury best practices. I encourage you to visit our website at treasurycareers.com. Now on to the exciting housekeeping items. The slides are currently available under the handouts area in your GoToWebinar control panel. If you have any issues downloading the handouts, please send me an email to ernie@treasurycareers.com. For those of you interested in CTP credits for today's webinar, you'll have to answer all the polling questions and remain on for the duration of the webinar. If anyone has any questions regarding CTP credit, please send me an email to ernie@treasurycareers.com. I'd like to hear from you today, so I can take your questions at any time in the questions area of your GoToWebinar control panel. I'll do my best to get to your questions during the Q&A session at the tail end of the webinar. Fear not, if I do not get to your question, I will follow up with you directly after the webinar to answer your question. Finally, we appreciate your consideration in taking a short survey at the end of the webinar today, as we always strive to improve the ROI we offer our event attendees for their valuable time. I want to go over our learning objectives as they offer my value proposition to you in investing your valuable time today. I'd like you to be able to understand current trends and benchmarks relative to T&E spend and best practices in T&E expense management. I'd like you to be able to identify specific opportunities to improve T&E expense management at your companies, and I'd like you to understand how companies are leveraging technology to mitigate expense report processing costs and control T&E spend. A few other objectives that I personally have for my webinars. Number one, I want you to smile or laugh. Yes, T&E expense reporting can be exciting and entertaining. Secondly, I want you to take an action, whether that's send me a LinkedIn invitation, listen to the webinar recording again, print out the slides, reach out to someone in your accounts payable area, talk to your CFO. It's really important to me that after you invest your time, you take an action as a result of the time you've invested with me today. So how am I going to accomplish my learning objectives today? Well, we're going to take a quick look and talk about why T&E expense management should matter to CFOs. Some of you hopefully on the webinar are going to be inspired to look at investing in T&E automation if you're not already there, and you're going to have to convince your CFO why T&E expense management matters, and we have some compelling information that should make that pretty easy for you to do. We'll talk about how to manage T&E expenses, 3 key areas: visibility, benchmarking, and control. And there's really 2 areas. You need to control where you spend your money, how you spend your money, but you also need to have visibility, benchmarking, and control in terms of the amount that it costs you to process T&E expense reports. So we'll cover both of those areas today in detail. So again, you want to manage what you're spending, how you're spending it, but also you want to mitigate those processing costs. And the processing costs, to me, were mind-blowing when I really started getting into the weeds. So that's an area that offers a lot of low-hanging fruit. And so there are many dimensions to the value proposition in investing in T&E automation to improve the T&E expense management of your company. And we'll talk about T&E benchmarks, and then we'll talk about how to leverage T&E technology in order to mitigate expense management costs of your company. And then we'll also talk about T&E fraud mitigation and control. I don't see this talked about enough. T&E fraud is absolutely a cost of ineffective T&E expense management. And there's really 2 parts there as well. There's intentional and unintentional T&E fraud. The vast majority of companies that I talk to, even if they have a T&E policy, it's normally the case that their travelers don't understand their policy. So if you look at it on paper, if people are spending out of policy, that's actually T&E expense fraud. So you want to get a handle on that, and we'll talk about some sources of fraud and how to mitigate that fraud, and then we'll offer some closing thoughts and some additional resources. I'm not going to be able to address all your concerns and be able to tell you exactly how to mitigate T&E expenses at your company, but hopefully I'm going to give you the information to ask the right questions, have the right conversation, and then point you to some resources where you're going to be able to do that research, make that business case, and also if you're in the process of looking for that provider, things you need to look for in that provider. So why T&E expense matters. I love these statistics. $293.1 billion spent by U.S. companies, and that's up 4% from the previous year. I don't see that going down. One of the reasons that I see this trend going up and continue to go up is that we're going to much more of a subscription economy. So companies, we all really have to earn our clients' business. So it's not the old days where we would sell someone something, a big ticket item, and then we could treat folks as a transaction. We need to earn that business continually. So what does that mean? If we're going to earn that business, we're going to have to make that investment. We're going to have those face-to-face conversations. And the other part of it is that we're also need to be more engaged with our employees as well. So we might need to visit some of our subsidiaries as well. And then also why T&E matters. T&E ranks as the second most difficult operating expense category to control. And this is really a key pillar of the value proposition for T&E expense automation that I don't think is communicated enough from the webinars that I've attended and the conference session. It comes down to this. If you're able to control T&E expenses, you're able to leverage those best practices against the enterprise and really help your company really control expenses across the enterprise. So again, if we can tame the T&E beast, we're going to be able to do a good job in mitigating expenses across the enterprise. Now here's another area that I like to cover that I don't see covered enough at all. So this time of year, we're going through our budgeting, right? So I think sometimes companies need to take a step back and really look at, okay, why are we investing in T&E travel? So as you're going through that budgeting process, you want to take a look at this, see if you have visibility into that, challenge some of your managers. So this is some interesting information from Carlson and Wagonlit Travel. So it just shows some of the areas where the purpose of business travel. And then, of course, on the other side of that is the reported benefits of business travel. So top of the line is obviously business development, and I would expect that number to be higher. So I think it's important as we're in the budgeting season, we want to start to look at, okay, how do we mitigate the amount of money that we spend? And some of it is also making sure that we're spending money in the right areas. And so we need to look at the ROI of that business travel as well. So that's also a part of that effective management of the T&E expenses is really helping our folks tie the ROI to our T&E spend. So I think there's a lot more dimensions to effective T&E expense management than most companies realize. So let's get into effective T&E expense management. Again, my three pillars: visibility, benchmarking, and control. And then also number 4 is mitigating processing and reporting costs. So the first 3 are most commonly talked about in terms of how you manage the amount of money spent, but also it's very important to look at those processing and reporting costs. And a lot of the content out there is around processing and reporting costs, which is absolutely important, but we really need to look at both of those dimensions and also be able to have the amount of visibility, benchmarking, and control that we need. So in terms of T&E expense visibility, seems like common sense, but if you can't manage what you can't see. So you have to have that visibility into what is being spent, and we'll get into some benchmarks a little bit later. So you need to see what's being spent, who's spending it, look at why they're spending it, what categories they're being spent in, what are the trends over time, what are our spending habits versus our industry, and then also internally, if maybe you're looking within your sales department, can we look at spending trends among people that might be in our sales department? For example, you need to know how much it costs your company to process an expense report. So if you haven't gone through that exercise, that's absolutely very important to do. We'll talk about how you might go about doing that. So there's a lot of inefficiencies there, and there's hard dollar costs, but also there's an awful lot of productivity costs as well in terms of manual processes, exception items, chasing down paper receipts. So there's an awful lot of productivity costs for companies if your processes aren't automated. You need a system that gives you company visibility again into that spend, and you need a system that allows your company to deliver T&E expense reporting to travelers, managers, and company leaders to benchmark and actively manage that T&E spend. So again, I think the key pillar is that visibility, so you need to establish that visibility. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and launch our first polling question to benchmark where you are, the audience, in terms of the visibility that you have into your T&E spend. So I've gone ahead and launched our first polling question. I would appreciate everyone's consideration in answering all of our polling questions today. Those of you who are interested in receiving CTP credits for today's webinar, you will have to answer all of our polling questions today. Just want to remind you, as I will do several times during the webinar, that I can take your questions in the questions area of your GoToWebinar control panel. So in order to be mindful of our time, I'm going to go ahead and I am going to leave the polling question up for another 5 or 10 seconds or so, and then I'm going to go ahead and give us a quick look at the results, kind of offer a little color commentary there, and then we're going to return to our content and we're going to start talking about some of the interesting T&E benchmarking data that we have, and a lot of it comes from the 2017 Certified Annual Expense Management Trends Report. Just fascinating information, so I encourage you to read that after the webinar. I will have a link in there after the webinar. I'm going to go ahead and close the polling question, and I'm going to go ahead and share those results. So it looks like if we look at good and what would I say great is 46%. So that's very good news. So those of you who have that level of visibility, that's really really the first step. And those of you who have good and excellent, you may already have a web-based T&E expense management system in place, but it's important to note that you need to make sure that you're getting the most out of that system. So we'll talk about some of the value proposition, some of the components of the ROI, and make sure that you're getting all those components of ROI, getting all those features that you deserve from your system. And then we have not bad, it should be better. So those of you in that category, you may be in the process of possibly, you realize there's an issue, you may be looking at T&E expense report providers. So again, we'll talk about some of the key features. And then in this part of the game, I think it's very important to look at sort of the providers in terms of the customer service, the functionality, and the commitment to the functionality. And then we've got 22% in the poor area. And those of you, you may be in a completely manual world, in the Excel spreadsheets world. So hopefully this is going to motivate you to really take a look at the business case for your company. Again, take a look at the first part might just be seeing how much it costs to process an expense report and look at the cost, and then the business case will almost make itself. So again, we talked about visibility. So now let's take a look at some benchmarks. This information is from another great research report put out by Certified, the Certified Spend Smart report from Q4 2016. So this can really give us some important information, benchmarks in terms of meals, and then for your company, it's important that you're able to put the spend into categories. So again, at the top, we have meals and airfare, 19-15%, lodging, 14%. I think what we're starting to see in some of the 2017 data that I'm seeing, I think we're starting to see airfare overcome there, and we still see a pretty big number in the miscellaneous category. I've seen that over the past 3 years in the Certified Annual Report. I think part of that is just the categorization of expenses. I think what we're starting to see is companies are going to need a category for Uber and Lyft, and then we might need something for Airbnb as well. So I think the way that we travel is changing, so that's something that we want to be taking a look at. So in terms of benchmarks, again, what you'll want to look at the benchmarks in themselves relative to your industry, what they are, but you'll also want to look at your benchmarks over time as well. So that's really important. So you want to look at your trends over time. So, but you don't want to get a false sense of security if you're looking at your benchmarks over time. So it might be the case that your company has this big improvement. We improve by 5 to 10%, but it depends on your starting point, right? If you're already way off base and you improve 10%, that you wouldn't want to spend too much time patting yourself on the back. So it's important that we look at that we benchmark over industry, look at that, and we also want to benchmark how we're doing over time. And of course, our ability to do that depends on the visibility that we have, the reporting tools that we have at our disposal. So again, just some interesting information to have on those benchmarks. And then some of the really cool advancements that I've seen in the research over the past few years is how deep you can go into the spend. And just an example, there's information on you can get into the most expense brands. You can have fun with this in managing your T&E spend, so you can actually see how much your folks are spending at Starbucks. So you might have a benchmark. You might say, hey, John, you spend way too much at Starbucks. So there's really some interesting ways. The more information that you have, the more tools that you have to manage that spend, to benchmark that spend. And again, what you also want to get to looking at what is the ROI of the spend that we have, in all these different categories. And then the other point of this slide is just, you're looking at the expense brands. So if we'd have looked at this, had this information 10 years ago or so, we wouldn't have seen Uber up there. We wouldn't have seen Amazon up there. So it's really changed. We've changed the way that we're traveling, and so the expectations of our travelers are changing as well. So how do we support our travelers, and then how are they spending that money? So again, it really speaks to some of the disruption in how travel is changing. And then later on in the presentation, we'll absolutely talk about some of the value proposition in terms of the functionality. And what we'll see there is that companies are able to take more control over travel and make sure that their companies are getting the best rates. So integrated travel services as well. So again, we have the visibility, we have the benchmarks. So how do we establish that control? So one of the ways that we can have that control at our companies is through our policy. So some interesting data from the Certified Annual Expense Management Trends reports. So on a high level, in terms of your policy category limits, this actually frightens me a little bit, to be honest with you. No category spending limits, 26%. Based on historical spending, again, that's a little bit dangerous, right? If your company is doing terrible, then if you lower by 5 or 10%, or you can raise it 5 or 10%, you're going to be doing even worse than before. The annual budgeting process, again, it's really almost in all the categories except for the per diem, there's really no data-driven decision-making going on. So, so we have to have the right policy in place. So we have to set those limits in benchmarks, and of course we want to engage our travelers and see where they need to spend money. But again, it has to be the ROI, what's going on in our industry. But we have to have that visibility. And the other part of that policy is our travelers need to have an IQ. So when I worked in Treasury, I think the only time I saw the travel policy was when I was hired and I just signed the bottom of the yellow sheet. I really didn't know what the limits were, what they were for. I wasn't educated. I actually had folks that worked for me and I was approving their reports, and I really didn't have that IQ. So part of the way to really control T&E expense is that traveler policy IQ. Again, you have to have the policy, the right policy, but the other side of that is you have to enforce that policy. So if we look at the control in terms of people and systems, so hopefully we have that policy. How are we making sure that compliance? We have, again, a little bit of disturbing numbers, but employee is responsible, so that's 39%. The good news is on a lot of the T&E expense management systems, you can actually automate some of the policy compliance. So that if someone is trying to create or submit an expense reports, you can have a hard stop, which is a red flag. You can give them a warning that goes to their manager so you can stop it before they spend, or it can send a warning out to their manager afterwards. Specific example, I was out to dinner with a client of mine, and they were using a mobile-based application. They scanned in all the receipts from dinner, and then they were showing me how it worked. It was really easy, but then when they tried to submit, they got a red flag. And what happened was that they forgot to add me on there as an additional person, so that was outside of their limits. So I saw really firsthand how powerful that can be. And so anything you can do to automate that compliance and then automate the audits, that's going to be tremendously valuable. And then 41% manager manually approves each expense. Now that's going to take a lot of time. That is a high bar to ask of the manager. And then I would imagine that if you go back and look in how accurate your managers were with enforcing policy, you might not be too pleased. That's something that you want to do. You want to see if you can automate that. And there are tools out there. We'll talk about that at the very end of the webinar. There's actually artificial intelligence is being leveraged to do that as well. And then again, there's a little bit less, manager checking only high value expenses. And then 26% is what I like. T&E automatically flags out of policy violations. I think if you really start to look at your spend, you really dig deep, you look at how much out of policy spend that you have, you'll probably be a little bit surprised about that. And that really helps make that business case as well. And then 7%, your T&E policy is not enforced, so you basically have no control, and you're assuming that your people spend money like it's their own. And so, I think it's just interesting there, on the control side. But again, on the control side, what I like to see is a lot of the solutions, a lot of the compliance to the policy is really automated, and also some of the audits are automated. And then again, control, also I think control is just enhanced by that education as well, because people have that accountability and managers have that accountability. So now let's shift gears a little bit. So we talked about on the controlling the cost side. So let's now shift gears to a little bit in terms of expense processing inefficiencies. For those of you who have never been on the weeds in T&E expense processing, this is probably going to be a little bit scary to you. It's absolutely fascinating to me. So if we start to look at how much hard dollar costs and how much time can be spent if we don't have the right systems in place, it's kind of mind-blowing. On the other side of that, the good news is the business case for T&E expense automation almost makes itself. So 23 minutes to complete an expense report, that scares me. I was a treasury manager for a long time. I want my folks to be out there selling. I don't want them to be doing expense reports. 15 to 22 minutes to correct expense report errors, and that probably includes time on the phone with maybe someone in accounts payable. So we look at that. We're getting up to 45 minutes an hour for each expense report. How much wasted time is that? How much lost productivity is that to our salesperson? So to me, in Treasury, I never wanted my salespeople to come to my desk when they were in town for a sales meeting, because they were spending so much time creating their reports on the phone, or there could have been a delay in how they're being reimbursed. So that's another part of the coin, to look at leveraging systems that allow us to pay our employees more effectively. And then the third one there is just reports with errors. Again, all these things are inefficiencies. And so we'll start to look at some key areas of inefficiencies and show how these inefficiencies impact productivity across the enterprise. Again, just by the very process, manual nature, we'll look at employees, managers, and then accountants. Employees, if you got to gather your receipts, write down non-receipt items, if you're using Excel, if you're not using a mobile app, if you're not scanning in items, you might have to print spreadsheets, staple reports, go back and forth, sign and date, present or mail to manager. Maybe your manager can't even approve things unless they're in the office. And then wait. So lost productivity on the employee side. So those who are creating the reports, those that are processing the reports. And then the managers. So if your managers have to go through that approval process, you might receive all the reports at different times during the month or the quarter. Again, you might not be able to approve those on the road. If you're on the road, You might have to expense them manually. You might have to stop. You might have to go through this back and forth process with your employee, sign route, approve reports to the next manager or AP. So some of these inefficiency slides, this will help you start to determine the cost for processing that expense report. So again, that's really a key thing that you want to make sure that you do, is you're going to have a handle on that, and then you can start to look at areas where you have bottlenecks, areas of obvious improvement, how we can make everyone's life easier. And then on the accounting side, part of this, a big part of this is these manual journal entries, having to make journal entries at all, just finding if you're auditing out of policy compliance, making sure the right approvals are in place, if people are putting GL codes on receipts, on different items on receipts, that we're getting those coded correctly. So with some upfront work, some of the systems now, as you're inputting an expense, it actually can assign the right GL code there. So we'll talk a little bit about more technology later, but again, these are all areas of inefficiencies and areas where you should look for opportunities, whether you're going to invest in AP automation or if you have a system in place to make sure that all these areas are being addressed. And then if you're not really in the weeds, I would go and talk to all these people. If I was the CFO or treasurer and we were looking at T&E expense automation, I would talk to my travelers, get on the phone, write an email, talk to my managers, talk about how much time they spent, go to my accounting department, talk to the people who are processing the report, and see where these inefficiencies really lie in the cost. And then that will identify opportunities to help your company mitigate these costs, and then to just put some numbers behind these conjectures, some trends year over year, which is interesting. Annual, again, certify annual expense management trends report, losing receipts, submitting without receipts. Again, that number is tremendously high. Failure to submit reports on time, times it takes, policy violations. So we talked about all these areas. So what this really tells us is this is really making some of the business case for us to invest in that T&E expense automation. And what you'll see, kind of the root cause of a lot of these things are due to the fact that the right technology isn't in place, the automation. There has to be process as well, but a lot of these frustrations can be taken away with the right system that's implemented correctly. So I'm going to go ahead and launch our second polling question, which is going to tee up the next part of my content, which I talked about. I'm asking you to share with us how much it costs your company to process an expense report. Again, I appreciate everyone's consideration in answering all of the polling questions during the webinar. Again, those of you who might be after CTP credit, you'll need to answer all polling questions on the webinar, and I'm going to give you a heads up. We are going to have 4 polling questions instead of 3 today, so make sure that you stay on for the duration of the webinar. Again, I would appreciate your questions in the questions area of the GoToWebinar control panel at any time during the webinar. So once again, I am going to go ahead and leave the polling question up for another 5 seconds or so. Then we're going to take a quick look at the results, and then I'm going to take a look at what the audience is saying versus what we're seeing in terms of some certified research, and then we'll talk about, give you a little bit more color around some of the hidden costs in terms of expense processing costs to help you undertake that exercise if you need to. And it looks like a good amount of people on the webinar is something that might be something that they want to do at their company. So again, we've got 42% of folks that don't track these costs. It's pretty much in line with what we saw from Certify, 44%. So again, in terms of effectively managing T&E costs, of course you want to control how you spend, but again, there's a lot of value to really mitigating your expense processing costs. And a big piece of that is just the productivity of everyone involved. And I love happy salespeople. As a CFO and finance professional, I love happy salespeople. I also love happy accountants as well, and I love my management to be happy. So a pretty well aligned. Those of you under $5 per report, fantastic. Kudos to you. And again, some of it is just about having that benchmark so you can have that climate of continual improvement. So it's not like you want to stop, I got to 5. Okay, you always want to be looking. You always want to be looking at that bottleneck. So there's always ways that you might be able to drive those costs down even more. So thank you very much for your consideration in answering the polling question. Again, you know, if we look at the results from the certified research, pretty much in line with the audience again, 41%, 44% versus 42% that we saw there. And then again, it's good to see that we've got some folks in that under $7 per report area. So just a little bit more color on the expense processing hidden costs, some of the dimensions that you want to capture: hours to create your travelers, review your managers and approve reports, hard cost if you're a manual process, you're using paper, printing, postage. If you are also on the back end distributing travel expense reimbursements, but checks, look at the cost of moving that to an ACH, time required for reconciliation, and of course reimbursement like I just said, and then lost productivity and lost opportunity. Let's take a little bit of a look in there because that can be a little bit tricky. So if you want to look at the individual employee, so maybe someone that's on the processing side is on the phone all the time, you can look at their hourly wage or salary, time spent per report, and then that would be kind of a good estimate or a pretty good estimate of your overhead cost per report, and then your sales rep, total available selling time divided by time spent per report, lost selling opportunity percentage. So again, I want to make my sales people as productive as possible. And then also what I have not mentioned yet, even though I am a treasury professional at heart, is just that visibility and benchmarking allows us to do a better job in terms of forecasting what that T&E spend is going to be, helps us do a better job of optimizing our working capital. Is going to make our treasury folks happy, because as a treasury professional, I do not want to borrow money when I don't have to. I want to invest excess funds as well as possible, and I do not want to enter into foreign exchange transactions if I do not have to. So now we're going to switch gears a little bit. So we talked a lot about you know, the 3 areas: visibility, benchmarking, control, processing costs. A lot of the issues that we have there just touched on how the technology can help us mitigate those. So we're going to delve a little bit more on the technology side of the game, and then we're going to talk about technology trends as well that we're seeing. So before we kick off that part of our presentation, I'm going to ask you another polling question. So I'm asking you to share with me what's the primary system your company uses to managing your T&E expenses. So once we get everyone on board to answer the polling question, which of course I appreciate everyone doing so, we're going to take a look at some survey results from the annual expense management trends report. We're going to see where the audience lies versus that, and then talk about some of my insights regarding where I see those numbers and kind of where I see room for improvement and what I think could really be a driver for companies in upgrading the system that they use to manage that their T&E expenses. So I'm going to go ahead and leave the polling question up for another 5 seconds or so. Then we're going to take a quick look at the results. So I'm going to go ahead and close the polling question and go ahead and share the results. So good to see there's 40% of you using a cloud-based T&E expense management solution. Again, I think technology is really a pillar for effective T&E expense management. Again, if you're using that type of solution, it's still good to take a deep look in there and make sure you're getting the value out of that. Look at your functionality, look at your features, and also talk to your travelers, see if they're using all the features available, see if your managers are using all the features available. So sometimes you can have a system in place, but it doesn't really matter if it's not being leveraged by all those involved as well as it possibly could be. 18% are you in Excel. I thought we'd see a little bit bigger number there. And 37% use an ERP or ERP module. My point there would be that these systems or modules were not designed to manage T&E expenses workflow, the automation, and some of the related technology. So I would say that those of you using an ERP module, you would do well to just take a look at the technology that's out there and look at that business case there. I think what you'll find is that it makes sense to really take a look at some of the solutions out there. So thank you very much again for your consideration answering the polling questions. So what we see here, T&E systems by company size, what we're seeing, not surprisingly, a lot of the larger companies have that web-based solution, Concur, Certify, IBM, etc. On our survey, we saw a little bit less people using Excel and a little bit more people in that ERP module. So those of you who are in the ERP module or in that homegrown space, again, my caution would be that these systems were not specifically designed for T&E expense management, and so there's a tremendous amount of functionality which we'll talk a lot more about. So I think that you can probably do better. So let's go ahead and pivot. So we see companies are investing more and more into these web-based solutions, and I think that trend's going to continue. I think a big part of that is just the education piece. I think there's a myth out there that these solutions are cost prohibitive. The cost per seat is absolutely compelling. Even if you look at it in terms of processing costs, if you have someone that travels at all, they need a seat, a lot of times it pays for itself just in terms of the efficiency, in terms of time spent processing costs with them productivity-wise or internally. So again, the bar is pretty easy to get over. So why companies invest? We talked about this, reduce expense processing costs. It's fantastic. But again, I think more of these people need to understand what their costs are to begin with so they can effectively build that business case. Lack of control over T&E spending. We talked about how companies are trying to control T&E spending, but again, I think quite a few may be falling short, and there are some things that we can do with these automated solutions that allow us to really automate that policy compliance and give us that control. And again, we're going to have that control. We have to have that visibility as well. Poor visibility, non-compliant, again, travel expenses, and then inconsistent and lengthy reimbursement cycles. So again, you might be out there trying to make this business case, so this can really benchmark to you why other folks are investing, and then we'll talk about some of the ROI that folks are able to receive for investing in all these areas. So if you're looking at systems, again, if you have a system, you want to make sure that these things are turned on, that you're leveraging these, and so don't be satisfied just because you might have that web-based solution. So you want automated features, process efficiency. Again, we want to reduce manual data information. It's good to have a mobile application, OCR receipt capture, anywhere accessibility makes it easy for employees. And so oftentimes I will hear that my travelers aren't going to like this, they're not tech savvy. The one thing that I always tell them is ask them if they would like to get paid more quickly, ask them if they'd like to spend less time doing their expense reports, and most of them are really happy. I've heard several stories where CFOs actually do a test group, get folks up and running on the new system, and then after a couple weeks, everyone is begging to get migrated over to that system. So and of course, a big part of that ease of function is going to be that mobile application. You can upload those receipts, you can scan those in, and there's also features right now where you can automatically start building out these expense reports. You can apply GL code. So it's fascinating to me as a Treasury professional how far the technology has come in this area. Again, I mentioned you want to look for compliance tools, enforce travel policy, and you can do that with hard controls, soft controls, and then you want to make sure that there's integrability with your other systems. So a lot of the systems built in the cloud were made to communicate with each other. And then you want to have reporting analytics. You want to get into process and spending by category, department, employee. So you want to be able to slice and dice, look at these trends, and then also you can actually get into employee behavior as well and look at those trends and put that accountability in place. So in terms of the ROI that folks are seeing to this investment. Again, some information from the annual T&E management survey, improved efficiency, expense report processing, reduction in paper costs. We'll talk about this in a moment. Travel booking control, that mobile accessibility, elimination of duplicate expenses, overhead staffing requirements, more accurate mileage tracking mapping. Some of the features right now, which can be really valuable for certain companies, is there's actually an application that actually allows your travelers to put in, if they're traveling and trying to reimburse for mileage, it puts in how far it actually is from point A to point B, so there's no more guessing. A lot of companies realize an awful lot of cost savings in tightening up the amount of mileage that is expensed versus what was actually traveled. Reduction in fraudulent expenses. Again, some of this can just be in terms of making policy compliance more effective, because as I said, on paper, if something is out of policy, it's actually a fraudulent expense. And then employee productivity. So what does this slide give me? This gives me my business case for AP automation right here. So those of you that are in that process and don't have this system in place yet, these give you all the components, and then again you have to put the dollars and the figures behind those, but that just gives you a sense of how compelling that business case is. So let me dive in just a little bit more on the travel booking and control. So we're seeing a lot more functionality in this area and some tremendous benefits in this area. So there's Pretrip Approval, and that requires manager authorization, fire to booking, and it's configurable by employee, policy, and specifics. So what's great about what this functionality offers us is it allows us to stop the expenses before they occur. So we're not on the back end trying to chase these down and prove these, so we can stop it. We can stop inefficiency before it happens. And then there's the lowest logical fare. So it's amazing, some of the integration of these systems. And the other thing along this side, travel booking, related to that is also some functionality around unused tickets as well. I've seen numbers between 5 and 8% of unused tickets, so that can be a big number as well. So that gives us, again, that visibility. So hopefully that sheds some good light on technology, what companies are using, and then the ROI side, why they're using it, and gives you some of the features that you want to look for, and helps you make that business case and really make sure that you're maximizing the dimensions of all the possible ROI to your investment. So now let's take a look at a piece, again, that I don't think gets enough attention, is on the expense fraud side. So we want to mitigate those expenses where it makes sense, and part of that is we want to mitigate fraudulent expenses. So I like to share just a slide. One of my previous webinar speakers, Ava Napik. So I just love this slide. So there's 4 types of T&E expense fraud schemes. Some of them aren't really. Some of them are schemes. There's mischaracterized expenses. Folks are putting these into the wrong categories, hiding them. Fictitious expenses, that would be the case where they don't exist. Making up receipts. You've got overstated expenses. There's different schemes there where companies will actually might get multiple quotes for a plane ticket, something of that. And then duplicate multiple reimbursements. That is absolutely possible if you don't have the technology and you don't have the audits available. So some of the technology that's available, it will actually flag duplicate expenses from an employee, especially if it's the same amount, multiple reimbursements. Also, if someone's trying to get reimbursed for the same event, it can identify that. Like you've already submitted something for an event, it might send out an alert to flag that expenses. So what we're seeing in terms of these fraud schemes is we're seeing companies actually start to turn to artificial intelligence. So related to this, there's technology out there, just some technology. One of the firms that's out there doing this is a company called Appszen, and so they're really kind of out in front of this. That's why I share this. I like to share what I see is kind of where we're going. It automates 100% of the reports. It looks for patterns, and so it can look for incorrect receipts, duplicate claims, out of policy, upgrades, and then also for those of you who are international, FCPA, anti-bribery, Sunshine Act compliance, and then VAT compliance. So some of the things, it can catch non-compliance before reimbursement, 80% savings on expense processing costs. It can help with that. Increase in financial risk detection, and then it's just an overall reduction in T&E spend from not having those fraudulent expenses. So again, this is kind of shows how fast we're changing and how we're going. And then Appszen actually integrates with a lot of the web-based T&E expense management solution. So in terms of managing that fraud effectively, and why companies don't do the best job and what you can do at your company. So there are issues we have. Most companies only audit 1 to 15%, and many still do it manually. So automating that is obviously going to be helpful. And so being able to automate that and get more visibility there is going to help. Companies don't have a formal T&E policy. Again, that is the backbone for everything. So there's really no control without that policy. And this I think is the biggest area where companies have an issue that they can take care of without much cost. Lack of effective employee training. Again, I think it's important that all of your travelers understand your travel policy. If you haven't done so in a long time, I would suggest you consider reviewing that travel policy. Look at the benchmarks, make sure they make sense, involve your travelers as well. And then I think that training needs to be done at least once a year, not just when the company is brought on board. The managers especially have to be engaged here and understand what it means, what they're approving, take some accountability there. And then sometimes the T&E policies, if they're too vague or out of line with relevant benchmarks, that's going to fuel some fraudulent spend. And then if we don't have that policy enforcement, as lax or non-existent, and then it's just human nature. If opportunities for fraud exist, we talked about 4 of those categories that exist. If opportunities exist, it's more likely that it is absolutely going to happen. And then some preventative measures here. So this would be a good slide. I always encourage folks to print out slides that I think might be particularly valuable. So I would suggest you implement a formal written travel and expense policy. There are samples out there. Again, as you're writing that formal policy, if you don't have one, I would suggest that you involve your travelers in this policy as well, and that helps with the accountability. You want to train your travelers on your policy, and you want to establish accountability in complying with your policy provisions and get them to see how important that is. Again, we want to enforce all of our policy provisions, and then we want to have cost monitoring measures. So we want to have proactive data monitoring and analysis. So we want to be looking at trends. So we want to look at how we're spending, why we're spending, and then we can dig a lot deeper how we're spending by employee. And then as I showed earlier, you can actually get into where the spending is occurring as well. Even if you're going to Starbucks, you can take control over that, so you can really start to dial in on effectively managing those T&E expense costs. So just a few closing thoughts before I wrap things up with our Q&A session. And just want to remind you before we start the Q&A session that I can still take your questions in the questions area of your GoToWebinar control panel. So the pillars of effective T&E expense management: visibility, benchmarking, and control. So visibility, you can't manage what you can't see. So in turn, you need to understand how you're spending your money. You need to benchmark that versus industry and yourself time over time. And then part of that, as you're looking at how you're spending your money and how much, you want to take a look at why are you spending that money, what is the ROI to that money, to spending that money, and then of course we want to establish the control over our spend. So we want to have that policy. We need to invest in having that policy, invest in policy compliance, which we want to do through educating our employees. And we also want to take a hard look at the processing cost in terms of processing an expense report. We want to make sure that we have that process mapped in detail
and then now we want to make sure that we're able to estimate that cost per report. This might require some investment in time. Again, you might have to have conversations with people across multiple departments, but as we start to look at T&E expense management, here's the way I like to look at things. This is where we are right now, so you can take a look at a lot of the information I've outlined, and this is where we want to go, and then how do we fill those gaps to get there. I think you'll find that that is going to be automation, and then you can start to see what is the value in terms of filling these gaps. So how am I going to lower cost, improve productivity, and then also potentially lower our overall spend. But another part of it could just be the portfolio of your T&E spend. So it might not be that you're saying, I want to lower my T&E expense by 20%. It might just be that you want to spend more effectively and get that ROI up relative to your T&E spend. So just a little bit of a different take on as far as T&E expenses are concerned. And then the dimensions of T&E expense automation value. So if you're looking at investing in T&E automation, you get your processing cost mitigation. Again, we talked about all the hidden costs there and how to measure some of the improvements there. Hard dollar cost, improved productivity costs, but don't forget our friends in Treasury, working capital optimization on that side of it. There's fraud cost mitigation, taking control of that fraud, those fraudulent expenses, eliminating out of policy expenses. I talked about improved working capital management, and then that improved productivity as well. Just a few comments in terms of those of you who might be engaging in making that business case for T&E expense automation. If you're going to make that business case, you really have two different constituencies. You have the folks that control the purse strings, CFO, treasurer, CEO, and then there's the folks who are going to impact and hopefully make their lives better. Your travelers, your folks in accounting and all your management. So you want to make sure that they are engaged in that business case. If you have someone that is Mr. or Mrs. No and doesn't like anything, you want to make sure that you engage them as you are building that business case. You want to do your best to lay out a formal business case, easily defensible assumptions, and then you want to establish the accountability of those key stakeholders. And then as you're presenting that business case, I would suggest you almost have a shareholders meeting with those who control the purse strings, but also those that are going to be impacted and sell that business case. And you want to present with confidence and passion there, because again, it's hard to go in the CFO's office and tell them you want to invest in T&E expense automation. If I would have done that back in the day, I would have gotten a strange look on my face at best. But I just think that the business case is so compelling here. Again, there are so many dimensions of T&E expense inefficiency at quite a few companies. Again, you start to peel back the onion a little bit, and there's tremendous value, not only cost value, but also strategic value. Those productivity impacts can be absolutely incredible. A few additional resources before I have a few Q&A. I talked a lot about the 2017 Expense Management Trend Survey Report. There's a hyperlink there. Certified Spend Smart Report, that's a quarterly report. It has really good information on benchmarks, and then a couple other resources, and then there's a lot of great thought leadership resources on the Certified website. So go ahead and take a few questions and then make a few closing comments here. First question is around a couple questions around the same topic. Is there a minimum number of expense reports that I need to process in order to make the economics make sense? The answer to that, I think I've tried to convey. I don't think that's really the only consideration. It's also about the amount of dollars that you're processing. So again, you're going to have savings from lower expense reporting costs, but there's also all those other benefits in terms of better managing that spend, eliminating out of policy expenses. So it might not be that you have a lot of expense reports, but it might be that on a few expense reports, I'm going to identify several $1,000s in out-of-policy expense and reduce that fraud. So you really want to make sure that you're looking at all the potential areas there. So a few questions around a couple of the different platforms. Again, I think it's a matter of looking at how your company travels now, how you're going to travel in the future. Take a look at all of the features that I outlined on a few of the slides in the presentation, and then just see how things at your company, and just see that the value is there. And so I think that's a part of it. Look at the customer service as well, and then just look at the investment in terms of upgrading the technology. Take a look at, is that technology development done in-house? Is it done outsourced? Where are they going? Why are they going? So where's that company going? Again, customer service. A couple questions around having global exposures. These solutions are absolutely available to support international operations, multiple currencies. We're seeing a lot more in multiple languages, so absolutely on that side of it. Let me go ahead and launch my final polling question here. As I take the last question, then I'll make a few closing comments. So our last question is just asking you to share with us your biggest pain point in regards to your T&E process. So last question I'll take is really around, again, I mentioned this a little bit, really around my travelers, issues in training my travelers, getting them to get on board. Again, in terms of your travelers, sometimes it makes sense depending on the size of your company. Sometimes people will identify the tech-savvy folks in their group and really train them, show them the benefits of the system, and then what will happen is you'll have these evangelists for those who are the initial folks that you onboard into your system. A lot of the systems are really easy to use, and so I think it's just about maybe getting the face time, because I think once you get in front of your travelers and they really get a sense of, my life's going to be easier, take less time, I'm going to get paid more quickly, I think that's really going to build up. And some of the CFOs I've talked to, they've actually gotten people, the sales VP talking to the CEO, we need to get all of our folks on this right now. So that's obviously the best case scenario for us, is having all those evangelists out in the field. So with that, I am going to go ahead and close our polling question. Take a quick look at the results to let you see those. Manager approval processes, again, I think that is very much addressed with the right T&E solution. Lack of awareness of our T&E policy, again, I think that's more about getting the investment internally from your leaders, maybe having lunch, making sure that you need to educate your travelers, and I think that awareness is key. But the other part of that is obviously having controls in place and possibly automating those controls from our solution. So thank you very much, everyone, for your time in answering the polling question. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and formally wrap up the Q&A session. I would like to once again thank our webinar sponsor, Certify. We sincerely appreciate and share their commitment to thought leadership. I look forward to having you all attend future Treasury Careers webinars. Thank you very much for your valuable time, and make the rest of your day great.